remember that you're going to use the second Excel file to practice while watching those videos. So we're going to use the solver, which is really important product of Excel. Allows you to do statistical analysis within Excel. So let us start first with the skill 815.
To use Solver, on the Data tab in the Analysis group, click the Solver button. In the Solver Parameters dialog, enter the objective cell reference or name in the Set Objective box. Click the Radio button to find the maximum or minimum result value for the formula, or click the Value of Radio button and enter a specific value to solve for. In the By Changing Variables Cells box, enter the cells you want Solver to manipulate to reach the objective target. To add rules for Solver to follow, click the Add button next to the subject to the Constraints box. In the Cell Reference box, enter the cell containing the variable you want to place limits on. Expand the drop-down list in the middle box and select an operator. In the Constraint box, enter the limit value. Click OK to add the constraint. When you have added all the constraints, click the Solve button. Solver works through all the possible values for the variables and tries to find a solution within the constraints you defined. If Solver is successful, the values are applied to the worksheet. If necessary, move the Solver Results dialog so you can see the effect on the worksheet. If you want to apply the solution immediately, click OK in the Solver Results dialog.
And you will see the reports in this way. Okay, it's good to practice with it before you try to do any of assignments related to Solver. Okay, neat. Now this is really important in Excel, which I consider it as a bug. Usually when you have data and you created pivot tables and then you made some changes in the original Excel file, apparently it's not going to be changed automatically inside your pivot table. So a work around Excel did for that regard is adding this refresh button inside. So whenever you do changes in your Excel file and you want to see the result inside pivot, in the pivot table, try to click the refresh and you should see those results. So let us see an example about what I'm talking about. So as you can see here, pivot table that contains some data, and you decided to delete those two rows in this data. Okay, the item 1027. However, you can see when you go to the pivot table, they are still there. So you go to analysis and analyze, you refresh, and now they disappear. That's the way Excel provided us with refreshing button. I would say this is, a bug, because otherwise it should be done automatically. So let's look at the pivot table, the source. Let's look for a specific item or area. Now you see that it is correct. Okay, next, adding a calculated field to pivot table.
To add a calculated field to a pivot table, on the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab, if necessary, click the Calculations button to display the calculations group, and then click Fields, Items, and Sets. Select Calculated Field. In the Insert Calculated Field dialog, type a header title for the field in the name box. In the Formula box, delete the 0 and type the formula you want to calculate. Do not delete the equal sign. To include fields from the pivot table, double-click the field name in the fields list, or click the field name once and then click the Insert Field button. Click OK to add the calculated field to the pivot table.
So as if how you had in Excel, opportunity to create a new columns based on some formula of maybe summing some columns available in Excel, or subtracting or multiplying. This is very similar. You are creating a calculated field inside the pivot table in this way. We're going to group now fields in pivot table.
To add groupings to a pivot table, click a cell in the pivot table with the type of data you want to group by, a date or number. On the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab, if necessary, click the Group button to display the grouped group. Click the Group Field button. In the grouping dialog, Excel automatically detects and enters the start and end values based on the values in the pivot table. Select how you want the data grouped. For date, you can select multiple grouping levels, such as months, quarters, and years. Click OK.
Okay. Another way of visualizing the data. So it was years, now we have by, quarters, and months. We're going to filter now the pivot table data.
To add a report filter, click the field name in the Pivot Table Fields pane and drag it to the filter box. The report filter appears in row 1 above the pivot table. Click the filter arrow, select the value you want to filter by, and click OK. To filter pivot table data using slicers, on the Pivot Table Tools Analysis tab in the Sort and Filter group, click the Insert Slicer button. In the Insert Slicers dialog, click the checkboxes for the fields you want to create slicers for, and then click OK. A separate slicer opens for each field, listing the available values. Click the buttons in each slicer to apply filtering to the pivot table. Some slicer buttons may become unavailable as you make selections, indicating that there are no data available for that option under the current filtering conditions.
And I would say here that usually you do not do the filter of all your items by selecting one of them and then you do the slicers. So either or. So my suggestion would be not to create an overall item and select one and use the slicers. That is more used in general. We're going to learn how to filter pivot table data now with timeline.
To add a timeline filter to a pivot table, on the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab in the Filter group, click the Insert Timeline button. In the Insert Timeline dialog, click the checkbox for the field you want to create a timeline for, and then click OK. A timeline opens for the selected field. Click a segment on the timeline to apply filtering to the pivot table.
And that's really a useful tool, especially when you have data, time series data. What else? So you can do both at the same time. You can use the slicer for specific items to show and the timeline as you have seen here. Again, you can synchronize all of them if you do some type of association. So we'll see it soon. Changing the look of the pivot table.
As with other tables, you can apply a quick style to a pivot table to give it a professional, polished appearance. Click anywhere in the pivot table. On the Pivot Table Tools Design tab in the Pivot Table Styles group, click the More button to expand the Quick Style gallery. Click a style to apply it to the pivot table.
just for design purpose. Filtering data in PivotChart now.
To add a slicer to the pivot chart, on the PivotChart Tools Analyze tab in the Data group, click the Insert Slicer button. In the Insert Slicers dialog, click the checkboxes for the fields you want to create slicers for, and then click OK. Click the buttons in each slicer for the data values you want to display.
Which is a really nice slicer and chart at the same time. We're going to look at how you can change the look of the pivot charts.
To change the pivot chart type, on the PivotChart Tools Design tab in the Type group, click the Change Chart Type button. At the left side of the Change Chart Type dialog, click a chart type category to display the category in the right pane. Along the top of the right pane are the subcategories for the selected chart type. Click a subcategory and then click the chart type you want. Click OK. To apply a chart quick style to a pivot chart, on the PivotChart Tools Design tab in the Chart Styles group, click the style you want to use, or click the More button to see all of the quick styles available.
Okay. And that was the last part